This talk is based on a paper that I published in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews, which is a journal published by Elsevier that generally has papers that are, in my estimation, written by climate alarmists or people along those lines. So, now there's no question that in terms of scientific journals, there's a heck of a lot of bias against people who write papers that question the sort of received wisdom. But this proves that it can be done. And in fact, I have been asked to be a reviewer of other papers, most of which I find not too good, but that proves that people who dispute the conventional wisdom about global warming can get published. Now, I had to be very careful in my wording, I admit that. But we will talk about this a little later. Now, the key to my talk is, are we actually reducing CO2, carbon dioxide, by using renewables? It's received wisdom that if we build solar collectors, wind turbines and the like, that we will reduce CO2 and maybe reduce the effects of global warming. Has this been proved? I don't think so. Now, I use as my guideline some of the work of Bastiat, the French economist of the 19th century, what is seen and what is not seen. Quite often in human affairs, we see something, but we do not see the unintended consequences, or what is not seen. He used the example of a little boy who breaks a window by throwing a rock through it. The glazier comes, he replaces the window, and this increases gross domestic product because money changes hands and so on. But what is not seen is what the glazier would do if the window was not broken. He would go and install windows in new houses or replace other windows. The gross domestic product would be about the same. So Bastiat spent some time talking about this, and this is quite analogous. The previous speaker talked about analogies, and I will end my talk with, I think, a powerful analogy. Everyone has seen these pictures of windmills in the National Geographic and 10,000 other magazines. What do we see? What don't we see? What we don't see is what is necessary to make the power which is supplied by windmills, there's no question about that, viable for houses and businesses. The windmills by themselves cannot supply all the power that houses and businesses require. Some of you have probably read newspaper articles when a new solar or wind installation is set up. It says these windmills or these solar collectors will supply power to 100,000 houses or 500,000 houses. In reality, they supply, or they power, the exact wording is they will power 100,000 houses or 500,000 houses. In reality, they power 0 houses. How can that be? Because in my house, I am supplied by Nevada Energy from a variety of sources. A very small amount from windmills, very small amount from solar, mostly coal, which they're trying to phase out, and natural gas. That is the source of my power. It's a mixture of power. So when you read in the newspaper that windmills or solar collectors will power 100,000 houses or 1 million houses, that's simply incorrect. They power 0 houses. They will supply some power to some houses at some time, but they do not power houses or businesses. So the question of this paper is, how much CO2 reduction will we achieve by using renewable energy sources? Now, of course, renewable energy sources encompass a wide variety. We're all familiar with solar and wind, but there's biofuels and other forms. Now, if you have a small number of solar collectors or windmills, you're actually reducing CO2 almost on a one-to-one basis. In other words, if you are just having a small installation, you're actually reducing CO2 by the amount of energy. Let me retract that. You're reducing CO2 production by the amount that is replaced by the solar or wind. But what happens when fossil fuel backup is turned on and off? In other words, when the familiar problem, you've probably heard this phrase 10,000 times, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, what do? Here's a simple analogy. I generally think in terms of analogy. Consider the best-selling car in 2011, the Toyota Camry, at least in the United States. The mileage on the highway is approximately 33 miles per gallon. The mileage in the city is about 22 miles per gallon. This applies to the ratio of 1.5, 33 over 22, is not too different from most cars on the road. Now, who are the highway drivers? These are people who spend all their time on the highway. They only stop to go to the bathroom or buy some snacks. People in the city, you could think of taxis. They never go out on the highway, or almost never. They are continually stopping and going. That is why, and this is just an approximate curve. I'm not trying to draw it exactly. In fact, there's only 2 data points that the Environmental Protection Agency supplies. So highway miles per gallon is always higher than city miles per gallon. Can you see the analogy? On the highway, you're almost never stopping, except for refueling, snacks, bathroom, and so on. In the city, you're continually in traffic jams, stoplights, and so on. This is quite analogous to what we see in wind, except in a car, you are in control. You know when to stop and when to go. The wind decides for itself when to stop and when to go. So stop and starts reduce efficiency. Actually, if you think about it, it's greater pollution per mile driven. The EPA doesn't say that, but if you think about it, if your mileage is lower, you're producing more pollution per mile. Now, most people have not seen gas turbines, which are the backup for wind and solar. Most people have not seen them turned on and off, unless you're an electrical engineer or a manager for a public utility. But everyone has seen a lawnmower start. Now, at least we're not talking about electric lawnmowers. Gasoline lawnmowers are by far the greatest proportion of lawnmowers. In almost every case, you're going to see a big burst of pollution when it starts. And this is basically what happens when gas turbines are the backup for windmills. even little mistake, it's not even when the mover, it should be mower. It's later restarted. If you mow the lawn for half an hour, then go in for a drink, start it again, you're not going to see as big a cloud, but you will see you will see a lot more pollution than when the mower is rolling along the lawn. Now you might say, why do we use gas as a backup? It's very simple. Gas turbines can be turned on and off fairly quickly. It depends on the model and so on, but within half an hour or an hour, you can get it up to speed. Whereas coal plants or nuclear plants are designed to be baseload. In other words, they're designed to run continuously. And in fact, almost every utility uses natural gas for what they call peaking. In other words, where I live in Las Vegas, of course, during the day, the temperature gets high, people turn on their air conditioners, which they generally don't do during the night. So they have routines where they turn on the gas maybe around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and then they produce more gas. So as the temperature rises, they can meet the demand, and they watch the weather forecast so they know how much gas they're going to need the next day. And so this is a standard routine when things are predictable. But wind and solar are not predictable. Now in Las Vegas, the sun shines most of the time, but in most of the rest of the country and most of the rest of the world, it is not predictable. It's predictable in Las Vegas because we're in the middle of a desert. Why do we have a desert? Because there's almost no moisture. The sun shines almost all the time. But the wind is quite variable. Quite variable. So the analogy I drew with the Toyota Camry is applicable to the fossil fuel backup, that is the gas backup for when the wind does not blow. You create more CO2 by turning it on and off, just as when you're driving in the city, you're creating more CO2, hydrocarbons, various other pollutants, compared to when you're driving on the highway, you're going, say, 300 miles without stopping. I'm going to use a graph from Germany, which I think was used somewhat yesterday. They have what they call feed-in requirements. If you have a windmill or mostly solar collectors, you can feed in the power to the grid, and you get much greater reimbursement than people who have to pay for the power. So it's actually a money-making proposition in Germany, and a few other countries have this as well. In the United States, as far as I know, this is unknown. So when wind power is generated, the fossil fuel backups are turned on or off, depending on whether the wind is available. And as I said, this is frequent cycling. Now, in the case of when there is no intermittent power, as is the case in, say, Las Vegas and many other places, they know in advance how much gas they're going to use, and they gradually increase it for the peak, maybe around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then as business is shut down, people go home. They gradually reduce the gas. So by midnight or 2 a.m., they're just relying on the coal, nuclear, or other standard other baseload sources. So the key point I'm making here is when you have an intermittent source like wind or solar, the CO2 savings are vastly reduced as penetration increases. Now, people have said, and you may have heard this argument, when the wind isn't blowing in one area, maybe it'll blow in another area. And we can average it out by transmission lines and so on. If the wind is blowing, if the wind is not blowing in New York City and it's blowing in Houston, maybe somehow we could send it to New York, although I don't think Texans would really appreciate that. This is from the EON net system, 2004, and I think this is similar for subsequent years, although they haven't published data like this since 2004, because this is kind of embarrassing. This shows the total wind production for all of Germany. Germany is a big country, not as big as the United States, but goes from the Danish border all the way down to Austria. It's a huge country. This is the total wind power produced by the entire German system. And you can see it varies considerably. This is for 2004. It goes up on certain days to some pretty high values. It goes down to zero, or pretty close to zero on other days. We all know the wind is variable. This is for an entire country, not just one windmill. This is for thousands of windmills scattered throughout the country. So the idea that you could, if the wind isn't blowing in one area, you could send it to another area where the wind is. You could send wind power from one area to another area is completely false. Completely false. Now, one of the key questions is, can we store energy? This is one of the main drawbacks of a number of renewable energy forms. Now, biofuels have self-storage. Hydropower has self-storage. In other words, by definition, hydropower is a storage system. There have been various attempts to store energy. One of them is so-called pumped storage. That is a very simple concept. If you're producing more power than you can use at a certain point, you pump it up to some mountain or hill for a lake, and then you draw it down when you need more power, similar to a hydro dam, except this is in a man-made lake as opposed to a dam. There's a dam there. This is in South Carolina. There are only 17 such systems in the United States. A very tiny proportion of any excess wind power or solar power is handled this way. In principle, it could even out wind variability, but these are very tiny in comparison to electricity demand. Now, I know from personal experience in Nevada, at one point, about 2-3 years ago, because Las Vegas is surrounded by mountains, Nevada Energy was planning a pumped storage system. It was shot down by environmentalists. They said, well, you know, this might drown some desert tortoises up there, or kill certain vegetation, although it's highly unlikely that would have happened. But if you tried to build pumped storage in the United States today to help reduce variability of renewable energy, you would find it almost impossible. Almost all these pumped storage systems were built many years ago. But in principle, they could reduce the variability of wind and solar. People have proposed chemical storage, so-called molten salts. This goes back to 1974 when the first experiments were done in the University of Delaware in Nevada. Through the courtesy of Nevada ratepayers, they are building a molten salt facility in a place called Tonopah, which is in the middle of Nevada. But these are very expensive, and you lose a lot of energy in melting the salt and getting the energy out of the salt. So it has never proved commercially feasible. But on paper, and of course chemists love this, it could be viable, but the cost would have to come down considerably. The lead acid battery, people who have, if you read the Whole Earth catalog of the 1970s, some of the hippies wanted to build their own windmills and solar collectors, get off the grid, get away from those evil public utilities. They had to store the energy somehow. The lead acid battery was used, even though there's all kinds of environmental problems with disposing of them. That's another story. These are still after 130 years, the cheapest battery per energy stored, based on the chemistry. They were invented by Planté in France about 130 years ago. We have more efficient batteries. We do not have cheaper batteries. Again, if you're talking about powering a whole city or even a small town, the cost would be prohibitive for storing energy if you depended on wind or solar. Okay, the lithium batteries, very expensive. The Nissan Leaf, about $18,000 worth of batteries, holding about $1.50 worth of electrical energy. So I don't think we're going to use batteries to power a city or town. Maybe a house, if people are willing to spend the money. Now, this is all theoretical so far, but if you read my paper, and I have about 10 copies of the paper over here, as well as 2 or 3 copies of the slides, there are actual experiences where people have measured how much CO2 is actually saved. And the paper has many references. I won't go into all the details. There was the Colorado study by Bentek about 2-3 years ago. As I said, all the references are mentioned in the paper, which shows if you have a small number of windmills, you're saving the appropriate amount of CO2. That is, when the penetration is small, you're actually saving CO2, but just for a small number of windmills, 1, 5, 10, 20. But in some countries, they have much greater penetration of windmills. And by the way, the vertical scale is logarithmic. It's a little hard to read the numbers. But when we get to substantial penetration, that is 5, 10, 15% of the entire grid based on wind or solar, the amount of CO2 saved decreases substantially. Why is that? For the reasons I mentioned in the previous discussion. That is, you're continually turning on and off the natural gas turbines, and each time you turn it off, you get a burst of more CO2 than when the turbines are running continuously. There's the German study. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but it's in the references. in Denmark, Germany, Estonia, and so on. So the key point I'm making is when we have a small number of solar collectors or windmills, you're saving a bit of CO2. The actual amount is still very small because you're talking about small number of windmills, small number of solar collectors. But as you increase the penetration of wind and solar, and of course the advocates the alarmists say we must eliminate all fossil fuels, which of course would be impossible. You would still need natural gas in any case. And therefore if we eliminate, quote, all fossil fuels, we will reduce all CO2 close to zero, CO2 emissions, leave aside cars and so on, that's another story. And therefore, we will either alleviate global warming or eliminate it completely. And there have been various projections by the United Nations, IPCC. By 2080, we have to eliminate 80% of fossil fuels. There are various percentages, but the whole idea of solar and wind is to get rid of fossil fuels or reduce it close to zero. But I'm pointing out that as the penetration increases, we get down to maybe 4% CO2 saved. In other words, we are not saving CO2, we are not reducing CO2 as predicted. And these are these numbers, and this is sort of just a schematic because you notice there are no data points. That's because every utility system is a little different. They have different mixtures of nuclear, of coal, gas, and so on. In some countries, gas is used as the primary fossil fuel energy source. So it varies considerably. But the key point I'm making is as penetration increases, instead of saving a whole lot of CO2, we save much less than we anticipate. And here's some other results. Estonia in 2007, some quotes from De Groot and Lepere, who are independent scientists in the Netherlands. It's necessary to establish on the basis of data rather than model predictions a level of extra fuel. Because there is a huge industry of climate change alarmists, there are vast numbers of papers which are completely theoretical, which show that if you have enough solar energy and wind energy, you will eliminate almost all CO2 production. These are completely theoretical. They take no account of what actually has happened in various countries. The National Academy of Sciences, in a very obscure report, indicated that the amount of CO2 savings will be very small even if wind power is vastly used. So this has tremendous implications for energy policy. There's other intermittent renewables such as solar photovoltaic and solar thermal. These are being built in Nevada as I speak. The ratepayers are paying much more than they would for coal energy. But this is one of the mandates that was instituted in the Nevada legislature by a Republican, Senator Townsend. There are renewables which are exempt from this limitation, and I discussed this in the paper which has been distributed. Hydroelectricity, which by definition is self-storage. Geothermal, the energy is stored in the earth, but it's highly unlikely that geothermal will ever be form a substantial part of our energy mix. And President Obama has said 80% of American electricity should be supplied by 2035. Even if this happened, which I don't think is going to happen, very little CO2 will be saved. Very little CO2 will be saved. These are my conclusions. So there are considerable uncertainties in that curve, which is the main point that I'm trying to emphasize. There are different types of fossil fuels. Obviously, coal produces more CO2 than natural gas, but natural gas produces CO2, approximately half that of coal for the same amount of energy produced. A lot of literature is what I call polemic, trying to prove a point, as the previous speaker pointed out. It's partly a crusade, not so much a scientific story. The degree of intermittency is going to affect the results. In other words, we saw that graph from Germany. You have different degrees of intermittency. At the Altamont Pass in California, you have fairly strong winds, not exactly continuously, but more continuously than many other places. But it varies considerably from place to place. As Professor Hayden pointed out yesterday, whether you have open or closed gas turbines will affect results, closed cycle gas turbines. A lot of utilities do not supply data. I wrote to the Texas system to see where they have used an awful lot of windmills. Didn't get an answer. I said, how much CO2 are you actually saving? They couldn't answer it. Why is that? Because when utilities build windmills or solar collectors, they merely pass the costs on to the ratepayers. They put out a press release saying we have saved so much CO2. They never prove it. It's not in their interest to tell the truth. There are different types of fossil fuels that can be used as backup, and this is a bit repetitive. How variable is the wind? This is again related to the degree of intermittency. In some countries, like Denmark, they export a lot of their wind energy. Denmark is held up by Amory Lovins and other folks as like the epitome of renewable energy. When they have too much wind, they export it to Norway. Norway, it has the highest percentage of hydroelectricity of any country in the world because of their fjords and so on. So the energy is stored because Denmark happens to be close to Norway. They just send it across that sound, whose name I can't remember. And there's other uncertainties. But if you're exporting or importing wind energy or solar energy, this of course makes life a little more complicated in terms of calculations. So, do we have an action plan to reduce uncertainties? In principle, regulatory agencies, public utility commissions in the United States, and electrical utilities should gather and analyze data on the, quote, missing CO2 reductions. In reality, they do not. So, you will see statements by public utility commissions and electrical utilities that say we have saved so many thousands of tons, millions of tons of CO2 on the assumption that every unit of wind energy is saving a certain amount of CO2, regardless of whether you have one windmill or 10,000 windmills. This is simply incorrect. As I said, any expenditures on wind and other renewables are passed on to the consumer. They state that they're reducing CO2 emissions, but they fudge over how they calculate it. In fact, most of the time they don't just say, they don't give a number, they just say we are reducing global warming by reducing CO2 emissions. That's as far as they go. So consumers should know what reduction of CO2 they are getting for the increased costs. They do not know that now. In summary, the story of the tea bag label. And what does this have to do with wind? People who go down into the Grand Canyon are on donkeys to see the bottom of the Grand Canyon are told, reduce the load of what you carry as much as possible. Because this is less strain on the donkey, you don't want to carry hundreds of pounds. One couple said, we are going to reduce the load by cutting off the tea bag labels. Was this futile? Get the analogy? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Inhaber. Very good presentation. I do agree with your conclusions and the thrust of your message. I do want to point out, though, I think you're a little bit generous on the curve that you put up there. As I recall, the DeGroot and Lepere study indicated that more energy and resources would be used, fuel would be used by adding wind turbines. And also the Mentec study in Colorado said that the emission savings were 0 to negative by adding wind turbines. Anyway, you might want to comment on that.
Well, the data is variable. That's why I just sketched out the curve. It's possible that the savings are 0, so I will agree with you. It depends on the study because each utility system is somewhat different. So I was just sketching out, and in the paper I say this is just a rough idea. I'm not trying to put data points, but there's enough data that indicates the savings are very small once you have substantial penetration of renewables. So I agree with you.
Herbert, I think this is an important paper because basically the public favors wind. They think it's free and it saves CO2, and of course it doesn't. And to support what Steve Gorham just said, when you calculate the CO2 produced from the tons of cement and steel that's used in creating a windmill, I would agree it's 0 to negative. But I think to drive home the fact that windmills don't save CO2 is worthwhile. But in reality, windmills are probably the stupidest idea that's ever been conceived. And it's emblematic of the almost complete scientific ignorance of the world's public that they think wind can ever make a contribution to the electric grid. About 6 weeks ago, I wrote an article for Heartland on the absurdity of wind. My mentor was Howard Hayden. He's been my wind solar mentor since he wrote the book Solar Fraud some years ago. And I reviewed it, so anything I ever write on the subject, I pass by him, and he made huge contributions. Heartland submitted it to the Wall Street Journal, and they published it, I believe, on June 18th of last month. But I think what caught their fancy, it's hard to get editorials into the Wall Street Journal, was that I predicted the future, and Scott Armstrong might want to look into this. I made a prediction that in 10 years, our nation would have this gigantic sculpture garden of non-moving windmills. And I think that was a new idea for the journal, and they published it. But what was interesting, and here again, I want to give credit to Howard. They weren't sure when they would publish it, and I was in Russia on the 17th of June, when all of a sudden I get an email from the Journal saying that they've got a deadline. They want to go to press at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At that time, it was 10 o'clock my time in Russia. And they had 5 questions to ask me. They wanted me to reference certain things they hadn't mentioned in the previous week. And thank God I found Howard at his home in Pueblo, Colorado, ready to answer the questions that I was unable to answer at the spur of the moment in Russia. The article, thanks to Jane and Jeremy, is in all of your packets, and I think you'll find it interesting. I think they also liked my analogy that I thought the windmills would kind of look like aliens landing on the planet and then being frozen in space with their arms not moving. So I think you'll find an interesting article. But between Howard and I, we brought up all of the absurdities of wind. I mean, the absurdities are truly, I think we have more chance of building an anti-gravity machine than a useful wind turbine farm. Thank you.
My question is, I mean, the green energy is obviously economic suicide, but if there was a disaster such as an electromagnetic pulse from either, say, a solar flare or a nuclear detonation, and we lost our grid, wouldn't these windmills and solar panels and this system, wouldn't they be like life-saving for a few people?
Well, it's going to depend on where the energy from a certain windmill or group of windmills goes. I can't really talk about nuclear detonations or anything like that, but of course, the power has to flow through transmission lines of some sort. So if those transmission lines are destroyed or made ineffective, this would apply to all forms of energy, as far as I can tell.
I've been studying solar and wind for quite a few years. Both of them are proportional to area, where fossil fuels and nuclear are proportional to volume. So I don't need as great a land space for the fossil fuels and nuclear compared to solar and wind when we're looking on utility scales. And we have lifetimes around 20, 25 years for both solar and wind. My study sort of indicated it may take 8 years of generating carbon dioxide before I get 1 kilowatt hour out of either one of them that displaces CO2. And I don't know if this makes any sense to you or not, but it's a huge amount of energy going in to create both solar and wind. And if you look at, like a 1,000 megawatt output, I could have a 90% capacity factor from a nuclear plant, and I got 12% solar, 30% wind. It's monstrous to get the output from one solar plant. I need 5,000 megawatts of solar to generate the same amount of electricity as a 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant or coal. Anyway.
Well, I agree there. The basis of wind and solar and various other renewables in the public mind is the sun is free, the wind is free, therefore the power must be free. Not true.
I'd like to comment on a couple of interesting ironies about wind. In Pueblo, we have a power plant out northeast of town, and engineers had a tour of it recently, and they've got a combined cycle power station out there, but they also have, I think, 3 generators that are made by General Electric, and the utility keeps track of electricity in 15-minute intervals. And these new turbines can go from 0 to full power in a matter of 15 minutes. And they have designed these things especially to handle the fluctuations in wind power from generators made by GE out there on the wind turbines. I think it's kind of an interesting irony there. The other one is that in Denmark, they have a very finely tuned electrical system. It's combined heat and power. In other words, they use the waste heat around the cities and so forth, and there's this balance of electricity and heat that they use very nicely. Well, when the wind comes up and they generate a lot of electricity from wind, they have to export it, because if they then turn off or turn down their fossil units, then they're not providing the heat. So, it creates a great big imbalance in there. So I just thought the irony's kind of funny.
As I said, the Danes export their excess wind energy to hydroelectric dams. So then they have the storage built in because they happen to live next to Norway.
Well, actually, they have one grid that goes south and one grid that goes north. And if they generate in the south, then that's got to go to Germany.
Yes.
I have a question for which the answer is probably indeterminate, but you are probably the best one to maybe make an educated guess. You know, as a fellow of the American Nuclear Society, I am sure you know of all the many indeterminate things that the anti-nuclearists throw as questions about any nuclear plant that comes up, right?
Yes.
So let me throw one against the windmills. I want to ask you, what do we know about the effects of all these windmills in disturbing the natural air currents as the Earth moves around? I've always wondered, we talk about the nonlinear dynamics of the differential equations that describe the atmosphere and a butterfly changing something can maybe change the world climate. What about, have the anti-nuclears really looked into this?
I
And
don't.
maybe we should force them to do so. What do you think?
I'm in favor of that. To my knowledge, and I haven't read all of the literature on wind, I don't believe anyone has really looked at that at the moment.
Maybe make them do it.
I'd be in favor of that.
They have done some of those studies published by a person like Mark Jacobson from Stanford. They have stuff that they simulate, of course, and have that model saying that will dry out the land and that sort of thing. It's all googly-doop, by the way. Yeah. There are a lot of papers like that. I can point you to those things if you're interested.
Okay.
It's all boring, just really boring.
Okay, I can believe that. Okay, well, thank you very much.